People say a woman's place is in the kitchen, and my husband believed that absolutely right up until he signed his own financial death warrant on a champagne-stained tablecloth. He thought my nightly dinners proved I was a useless parasite. He had no idea the woman patiently seasoning his soup was the exact same person secretly controlling this city's entire economy. Brace yourself, because the price for his supreme arrogance has never been so brutally steep. Hello and welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero operating budget to keep bringing you these tales. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon to hear even more incredible, exclusive true stories that are longer, feature highly detailed scenarios, and use multiple emotional voice actors which we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive into today's story, told from the perspective of Isla Reynolds. The air inside the luxury downtown Seattle penthouse was heavy, suffocating beneath the overwhelming scents of designer perfumes, imported caviar, and vintage champagne. It was a dizzying display of extreme wealth, a glittering sanctuary suspended high above the dark city streets, completely detached from reality. This was Julian Sterling's moment of absolute triumph. He was hosting this lavish banquet to celebrate his highly anticipated promotion to the position of managing partner at the commercial real estate giant, Summit Crest Development. The room was packed with hundreds of the city's most elite figures, all buzzing with fake laughter and calculated flatteries. I stood alone in a shadowed corner of the grand room. At 34 years old, I wore a dress that was undeniably elegant but intentionally modest, a stark contrast to the shimmering, aggressively expensive gowns draped over the other women. I held a glass of sparkling water, my fingers perfectly still against the crystal, as I quietly observed the man I had wholeheartedly supported for the past 5 years. Julian was in his element, his face flushed with the intoxicating warmth of his own perceived greatness. He was surrounded by a circle of admirers, soaking in their praise like a dying man drinking water. He looked like a king, at least, that was the illusion he so desperately wanted to project. Suddenly, the sharp, clear ringing of a silver fork striking a champagne flute cut through the low hum of conversation. Julian stood at the center of the room, raising his glass high. The hundreds of guests immediately fell silent, turning their expectant faces toward him. He flashed a brilliant, practiced smile, thanking the executives and the wealthy investors for their unwavering faith in his vision. But then, the atmosphere shifted. His triumphant gaze slowly drifted across the room until it locked entirely on me. The warmth in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, arrogant contempt that made my stomach turn. The silence in the penthouse stretched, turning brittle and uncomfortable as the guests followed his gaze to my quiet corner. Julian let out a short, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. "I have climbed to the absolute top of this industry." Julian projected his voice so that every single person in the room could hear the cruelty in his words. "And I did it entirely on my own. Meanwhile, my dear wife over there has lived completely dependent on me all these years. Let us be entirely honest with ourselves tonight. Other than cooking around in the kitchen, she is completely useless." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some women covered their mouths in feigned shock, while several men awkwardly looked away, yet no one dared to intervene. The sheer humiliation was designed to crush me, to strip away my dignity in front of the most powerful people in Seattle. But before the heavy weight of his public insult could even fully settle over the room, the crowd parted. Julian's mother, Beatrice, stepped forward. She was a woman who wore her cruelty as proudly as the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. A vicious, triumphant smirk twisted her heavily made-up face as she marched straight toward me. In her hands, she held a thick manila folder. With a sharp, aggressive motion, Beatrice slammed the folder down onto the cold marble surface of the bar right in front of me. The papers inside slid out, revealing the undeniable header of a divorce petition. "You have been nothing but a stumbling block in my son's path to greatness," Beatrice snarled, her voice dropping into a venomous whisper that carried easily in the dead silent room. "You are a leech, Isla. We are done letting you drain his success. Sign the papers. You will give up every single right to his properties, his assets, and his future. You are leaving this marriage exactly as you entered it, with absolutely nothing." The entire room held its breath. The elite guests leaned in, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity, hungrily waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They fully expected me to burst into dramatic tears. They wanted a pathetic scene. They wanted to see me drop to my knees, sobbing and begging for forgiveness, pleading for a tiny fraction of Julian's newfound wealth. Instead, I looked down at the documents, then up at Beatrice's sneering face, and finally over to Julian, who was watching me with a smug, victorious grin. I did not shed a single tear. My breathing remained perfectly steady. I simply offered them a faint, almost pitying smile. Reaching into my clutch, I pulled out my pen, without a single moment of hesitation, without uttering a single word of argument. I leaned over the cold marble and signed my name on the dotted line with sharp, decisive strokes. The satisfying sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. When I set the pen down and pushed the signed papers back toward a visibly stunned Beatrice, the previous atmosphere of cruel mockery was instantly extinguished. It was replaced by a chilling, terrifying silence. They had expected a victim, but the woman walking calmly toward the elevator was entirely something else. As the polished steel doors of the elevator glided shut, sealing me away from the glittering penthouse, I could almost feel the arrogant jubilation radiating from the room I had just left. Julian and his mother were undoubtedly popping another bottle of imported champagne by now. Beatrice would be clutching those freshly signed divorce papers to her chest like a winning lottery ticket. In their narrow, self-serving minds, they had just successfully amputated a useless parasite. Julian was entirely convinced he had flawlessly protected the multi-million-dollar salary, the lucrative corporate stock options, and the lavish executive perks that awaited him on his first day as managing partner. He genuinely believed he had outmaneuvered a freeloader, ensuring I could never touch a single penny of his newly acquired empire. What they were actually celebrating, however, was a magnificent masterpiece of their own destructive greed. Beatrice had spent weeks paying exorbitant hourly rates to Seattle's most cutthroat corporate lawyers. She had instructed them to draft the most merciless, ironclad separation agreement legally possible. The document was designed to be a weapon of financial ruin, crafted specifically to leave me completely destitute on the streets. Its core feature was an aggressively specific clause that mandated the absolute and permanent separation of all physical properties, business shares, and most importantly, financial liabilities belonging to each individual. The airtight wording explicitly dictated that this total separation applied to everything accumulated both before and throughout the entirety of our 5-year marriage. There would be no shared assets, and absolutely no shared burdens. Later that exact same evening, while Julian was still downtown bathing in the sycophantic praise of his wealthy guests, I quietly entered our shared townhouse for the final time. I did not throw a hysterical tantrum. I did not smash his expensive vintage wine collection or tear apart his custom-tailored Italian suits. I simply packed a single, modest carry-on suitcase with my personal clothing and a few essential documents. The entire process took me less than 30 minutes before walking out the front door forever. I walked into the spotless, state-of-the-art kitchen. I took the simple linen apron I wore every single evening to prepare his elaborate meals, folded it methodically, and laid it dead center on the pristine marble island. It was his absolute favorite symbol of my domestic uselessness. I left it sitting right there as my silent, mocking goodbye. I stepped out into the crisp, biting night air and slid into the back seat of a waiting taxi. As the driver pulled away from the affluent, quiet suburban street, the golden glow of the streetlights flickered rhythmically across my face. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my secure secondary phone. I opened an encrypted communication channel linked directly to a private, highly classified number. My fingers tapped the illuminated screen with practiced, ruthless precision, composing a single, brief directive. Initiate the reclamation protocol. The fool has taken the bait. I hit send, watching the encrypted text vanish into the digital ether. A cold, deeply genuine smile finally touched my lips as I leaned back against the leather seat, gazing out the window at the towering, illuminated skyscrapers of the Seattle skyline. The ultimate tragedy of incredibly greedy people is that they are so entirely focused on hoarding the gold that they never bother to check the structural integrity of the floor standing beneath it. Julian and Beatrice were so blindly obsessed with walling off his supposed wealth that they completely failed to comprehend the dual nature of their own airtight legal trap. They had been so desperate to ensure I walked away with 0% of his money that they did not bother to thoroughly analyze the implications of separating our liabilities. They had absolutely no idea that by forcing me to sign away all shared responsibilities, the absolute separation of debt they had so viciously demanded had just become a perfectly tied hangman's noose, slipping quietly and securely around Julian's own neck. For the past 5 years, the narrative of my life was a carefully constructed illusion. Julian loved to mock the countless hours I spent meticulously preparing his evening meals. He thought I was obsessing over recipe books because I had absolutely nothing better to do. The truth was entirely different. Every elaborate dinner, every rare ingredient I sourced, was a calculated step in a massive business venture. I was not practicing to be a dutiful homemaker. I was conducting direct, hands-on product testing for a premium, nationwide organic agricultural supply chain I was in the final stages of acquiring. The exotic truffles and the pristine heirloom vegetables were raw materials for a logistics network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. While my husband sat in his office feeling superior, I was operating as the anonymous founder and the absolute majority voting shareholder of Ethelgard Holdings. My firm was a colossal private equity empire, moving like an invisible predator through the American economy, ruthlessly buying up prime commercial real estate and swallowing distressed corporations whole. Many people would ask why I chose to hide a financial empire of that magnitude behind a simple linen apron. It was, tragically, an act of pure, misguided love. I intimately knew the incredibly fragile nature of Julian's ego. If he had even the slightest suspicion that his quiet wife could effortlessly buy and sell his entire industry before her morning coffee, it would have completely shattered his fragile sense of manhood. I desperately wanted to protect him from the crushing, suffocating pressure of public scrutiny that comes with immense wealth. I chose to maintain the illusion of a normal, quiet, traditional marriage. I wanted to give him a safe harbor, a place where he had the breathing room to build his own legacy and prove his own competence without constantly standing in my terrifyingly large shadow. However, Julian did not use that supportive space to grow into a better man. Instead, he used it to inflate a monstrous, completely unfounded arrogance. Every single major professional victory he loudly claimed as his own was, in reality, a smooth path I had quietly paved for him in the dark. That sudden, miraculous influx of ultra-wealthy VIP clients who suddenly decided to trust a mid-level commercial real estate manager, I personally engineered those connections. I subtly directed my own shadow network of associates to cross paths with him at charity galas and golf tournaments. The incredibly favorable stabilization of commercial rent prices that miraculously saved his firm's largest accounts late last year. That was not market luck. That was my executive board at Ethelgard, intentionally manipulating the regional market rates to keep his firm afloat. He proudly stood on top of the invisible mountains I painstakingly built for him, pounded his chest, and loudly declared himself a self-made genius. He foolishly mistook my silent, structural support for his own inherent brilliance. His supreme, blinding confidence prevented him from seeing the fatal rot festering deep within his own corporate walls. Exactly 3 months ago, my elite team of forensic accountants at Ethelgard uncovered a truly catastrophic secret. Summit Crest Development was not the thriving real estate giant it pretended to be. It was a decaying, hollow shell teetering dangerously on the very edge of total financial collapse. They were suffocating under a massive mountain of severely toxic, actively hidden corporate debt. Instead of letting them naturally implode and vanish, I made a ruthless, calculated move, operating through a complex maze of untraceable shell companies. Ethelgard Holdings quietly purchased the vast majority of that crippling debt for mere pennies on the dollar, almost overnight, without a single soul in the Seattle business district realizing it. I became the absolute, supreme creditor of the very company that employed my arrogant husband. Which brings us to the hilarious, pathetic reality of his grand promotion party. Julian genuinely believed the old board of directors elevated him to managing partner because they finally recognized his spectacular, unparalleled talent. He honestly thought they were respectfully handing him the keys to the kingdom. He was so completely intoxicated by the sudden prestigious title, the promise of a massive salary, and the illusion of power that he entirely failed to read the room. He never noticed the terrified, desperate faces of the older men handing him the crown. His promotion was not a reward for his hard work. It was a desperate, cowardly sacrifice by a group of terrified executives. The old board of directors fully knew the massive debt bomb was only weeks away from completely detonating. They desperately needed a willing scapegoat, a wildly ambitious, blindly arrogant fool who would proudly stand at the helm when the ship finally snapped in half. They perfectly set him up to take the catastrophic fall, and Julian, thoroughly believing he was the undisputed king of the corporate world, happily marched forward and placed his own head right on their chopping block. While I was enjoying a quiet, perfectly brewed cup of coffee on the other side of the city, my soon-to-be ex-husband was eagerly walking right into a financial slaughterhouse. The sun rose over the Seattle skyline, casting a brilliant golden light against the towering glass facade of the Summit Crest Development headquarters. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. Julian strode through the massive revolving doors of the main lobby, wearing a brand-new, custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most of his employees made in 3 solid months. His chin was tilted upward at a sharp, arrogant angle. His expensive leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished granite floor, a sound he fully expected to be the drumbeat of his new reign. As he stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the 45th floor, his mind was completely consumed by glorious visions of the morning ahead. He anticipated walking out of those silver doors to a thunderous standing ovation. He expected lines of subordinate managers bowing their heads in deep submission, desperate to catch the eye of the newly crowned managing partner. He was completely ready for the champagne, the congratulatory handshakes, and the absolute power. The elevator chimed a soft, pleasant note, and the doors slid open. Julian stepped forward, a practiced, magnanimous smile plastered across his face, ready to graciously greet his loyal subjects. Instead of a roaring chorus of applause, a suffocating, terrifying silence crashed into him. The entire executive floor, usually buzzing with the frantic, loud energy of high-stakes real estate deals, was entirely dead. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with the sharp scent of nervous sweat and stale air. Julian paused, his smile faltering slightly as he surveyed the sprawling open-plan office. Dozens of employees were frozen at their desks, their faces pale and drawn. Not a single person dared to look him directly in the eye. Whenever his commanding gaze swept past them, they frantically averted their eyes, staring blankly at their dark computer monitors or aggressively shuffling completely useless papers. Then, Julian noticed the strangers. Moving methodically through the aisles were dozens of cold, unsmiling men and women dressed in sharp black suits. They operated with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. They were forensic corporate auditors. Julian watched in mounting confusion as they ruthlessly dismantled his so-called kingdom. They were hauling heavy cardboard boxes overflowing with confidential financial records out of the senior management offices. Bright red, legally binding security tape was aggressively slapped across rows of expensive computer towers and filing cabinets, sealing them completely shut. The glass walls of the primary conference room had been entirely covered with opaque white paper from the inside, blocking anyone from seeing the severe-looking legal teams operating within. The majestic coronation Julian had envisioned was completely absent. In its place was the grim, clinical execution of a ruthless corporate raid. A hot flash of pure, unadulterated rage surged up Julian's neck. He completely misunderstood the situation, blindly assuming this was some colossal logistical error or an incredibly poorly timed compliance check ordered by the incompetent former board members. How dared they interrupt his first official morning in power? He aggressively adjusted his silk tie and marched furiously down the center aisle, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly in the dead quiet room. He headed straight for the grand, curved mahogany desk of the head corporate secretary. "What in the absolute hell is going on here?" Julian snapped, slamming his heavy leather briefcase onto the top of her pristine desk. He leaned over, his voice dripping with venomous authority. "I am the new managing partner of this firm. Where is my welcome reception? Why is my executive floor swarming with these pathetic accountants? I want this entire floor cleared out immediately, and I want an explanation right this second." The head secretary slowly looked up at him. She was a woman who had worked at the firm for over 15 years, a hardened veteran of the corporate world who rarely showed any emotion, but right now, her face was completely drained of blood, resembling a pale, terrified ghost. Her hands were shaking so violently that the loose papers she was holding audibly rattled against the solid wood. She did not apologize. She did not cower. She just stared at him with a complex mixture of profound shock and deep, agonizing pity. "Wait, you do not know what happened. Julian," the secretary whispered, her voice trembling and barely carrying over the harsh sound of packing tape ripping in the background. "Know what?" Julian barked, his patience entirely exhausted, completely blind to the massive warning signs flashing right in front of his arrogant face. Without speaking another word, her shaking fingers pushed a single, strictly confidential corporate emergency memo across the polished wood toward him. Julian violently snatched the piece of paper, bringing it up to his face with a sharp huff of intense annoyance. His eyes quickly scanned the top of the page. The massive, bold black letters instantly burned themselves into his retinas. The legal document clearly stated that effective at exactly midnight last night, Summit Crest Development had been officially and completely dissolved. The entire corporate entity was being liquidated for immediate, aggressive restructuring under the direct management of its new parent company. And the final, utterly devastating paragraph delivered the ultimate killing blow. The entire former board of directors, the exact same men who had so happily promoted him less than 24 hours ago, had been terminated with immediate effect. They were stripped of all executive powers, permanently locked out of the building, and officially fired in the dead of the night. The air vanished from Julian's lungs. The magnificent throne he had so proudly climbed upon the night before was not just an illusion, it was a perfectly designed trapdoor, and someone had just violently pulled the lever. Julian's anger propelled him forward like a blind bull. He firmly refused to accept the terrifying reality printed on that emergency memo. In his deeply fractured mind, there was simply no way his absolute power could be stripped away before he even had the chance to wield it. He crumpled the paper in his fist, throwing it aggressively onto the secretary's desk, and stormed toward the private stairwell that led directly to the top-floor executive boardroom. He was the managing partner. He had the signed contract. He was going to walk into that room, fire whoever was orchestrating this absurd panic, and immediately restore order to his empire. He grabbed the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors and shoved them violently open. They crashed against the walls with a thunderous boom that echoed through the cavernous space. He opened his mouth to roar his first executive order, but the words instantly died in his dry throat. The majestic boardroom was not empty, nor was it occupied by the trembling, defeated faces of the old board of directors he expected to fire. Instead, the room was lined with an intimidating wall of the most ruthless, highly compensated corporate lawyers in all of Seattle. There were at least a dozen of them. men and women dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits, standing in solemn, unbroken silence around the perimeter of the giant mahogany conference table. Their cold, calculating eyes locked onto Julian the exact second he burst into the room. No one flinched, no one looked surprised. They simply observed him with the detached clinical interest of coroners examining a fresh corpse. At the far end of the long table, the massive high-backed leather chairman's chair was turned entirely away from the door, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city. A thin ribbon of steam rose from a porcelain cup, resting on the polished wood next to the chair. Someone was sitting there, quietly sipping black coffee, completely undisturbed by his violent entrance. "Who authorized this?" Julian demanded. Though his voice lacked its usual booming authority, it sounded thin, vibrating with a sudden, uncontrollable panic. "I demand to speak to the representative of the parent company right this second. I am the legal managing partner of this firm." The leather chair slowly began to rotate. The movement was agonizingly deliberate. As the figure in the seat came into full view, Julian felt the blood literally freeze in his veins. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. His brain violently short-circuited, entirely unable to process the impossible image sitting right in front of his eyes. It was me. I was not wearing a modest floral dress or a stained linen apron. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-fitted charcoal power suit that radiated absolute, unapologetic authority. My posture was perfectly straight, relaxed but commanding. I leaned back in the chairman's seat, resting my hands casually on the armrests, my eyes locking onto his with a cold, piercing intensity that was sharp enough to draw blood. Julian stumbled backward half a step. His jaw went completely slack. His face morphed from an angry, flushed red to a sickly ashen gray in a matter of seconds. He frantically looked around the room at the silent lawyers, desperately hoping this was some bizarre, elaborate hallucination. But the lawyers remained entirely still, respectfully deferring to the woman sitting at the head of the table. Julian finally managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. He pointed a violently shaking finger at me, desperately trying to aggressively cling to the deeply ingrained illusion of my inferiority. "What the absolute hell are you doing here? Get out of that chair. This is a secure corporate boardroom. Isla, this is not your kitchen." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my leather briefcase resting beside me and pulled out a massive stack of heavily bound legal acquisition documents. With a swift, forceful flick of my wrist, I threw the heavy files directly down the center of the table. They slid rapidly across the polished mahogany and slammed to a halt right at Julian's fingertips. "It might not be my kitchen," I replied, my voice smooth, quiet, and echoing with absolute finality. "But I am the exact person who owns the microwave that is currently burning your entire career to ashes, Julian." He stared down at the documents, his eyes darting frantically over the bold corporate logos and the dense legal text. He still could not comprehend it. He aggressively shook his head, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Let me make this incredibly simple for you. Since your reading comprehension seems to be completely failing you today," I continued, slowly standing up from the chair. I walked over to the expansive windows, looking down at the tiny cars moving on the streets below before turning back to face him squarely. "The company that officially dissolved Summit Crest Development at exactly midnight last night is Ethelgard Holdings. I am the absolute, undisputed chairman and the founding architect of that private equity firm. I personally hold 100% of the voting shares of the parent company that just completely swallowed your pathetic firm whole. You do not work for the board anymore. Julian, the board works for me, which means, as of this exact morning, you belong entirely to me." The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The arrogant, triumphant king from last night's banquet shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the heavy edge of the conference table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the carpeted floor. The staggering weight of the truth crushed the breath entirely out of him. The massive hidden debt, the sudden miraculous promotion, the ruthless corporate takeover. It was all perfectly orchestrated by the exact same woman he had publicly humiliated and discarded just hours ago. He realized, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that he was never a powerful executive king. He was nothing more than a cheap, disposable puppet dancing blindly on a stage I had entirely constructed, all for the singular purpose of orchestrating his ultimate destruction. You genuinely believe that losing this fancy executive title is the ultimate tragedy of your day. Julian, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed with terrifying clarity across the cavernous boardroom. The dozen high-powered corporate attorneys surrounding the mahogany table watched the execution with completely detached, silent approval. Julian was gasping for air, his chest heaving violently under his expensive custom-tailored suit. He looked like a man who had just been violently shoved out of an airplane and only realized halfway down that he forgot his parachute. "I am the managing partner," he choked out, still desperately trying to cling to the ghost of his authority. "You cannot fire me. I have a signed contract." "You are absolutely correct," I replied smoothly, signaling to my lead attorney with a slight nod of my head. The lawyer stepped forward, sliding a single, brightly highlighted sheet of heavy parchment paper out of a manila folder. He placed it gently onto the table directly in front of Julian's trembling hands. "You do have a signed contract, but you were so completely intoxicated by the smell of your own supposed greatness yesterday afternoon that you entirely bypassed the basic concept of professional due diligence. You were so desperate to grab the crown that you did not even bother to read the final pages." Julian stared down at the document. It was the executive employment agreement he had eagerly signed to secure his promotion. "The former board of directors knew this company was actively drowning," I explained, leaning forward and resting my hands flat against the cold table. "They desperately needed a wildly ambitious fool to stand at the wheel when the ship went down. By officially accepting the highest office in this firm, you legally triggered a highly specific condition deeply buried in your contract. You signed a binding personal guarantee for a massive percentage of the company's outstanding toxic liabilities. You legally tied your own social security number to tens of millions of dollars of unsecured debt. You are personally on the hook for every single penny this company owes to its primary creditor. And as we just established, I am that exact creditor." Julian's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. His pupils dilated until they were almost entirely black. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sickly, sweating corpse. "No!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. A sudden, desperate spark of hope ignited in his panicked eyes as he grasped at the only lifeline he could think of. "No, that is entirely illegal. We are legally married. State law clearly mandates that marital assets are combined. Your ridiculous private equity firm, your billions of dollars, they belong to this marriage just as much as they belong to you. You are legally obligated to cover this debt. You have to bail me out." I could not hold it back any longer. I let out a low, genuinely amused laugh that cut right through his pathetic screaming. "Oh, my sweet, wildly arrogant Julian," I sighed, shaking my head with exaggerated pity. "Did you seriously already forget the spectacular little theatrical performance you and your mother orchestrated last night at your lavish banquet?" His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. "Your mother was so completely terrified that the useless, kitchen-bound wife would somehow steal a tiny fraction of your imaginary wealth," I reminded him, my tone dripping with lethal sarcasm. "She paid an exorbitant amount of money to have her lawyers draft a truly draconian separation agreement. She aggressively demanded the absolute, permanent, and irrevocable separation of all financial assets and, most importantly, all financial liabilities. She insisted in writing that there would be no shared wealth and absolutely no shared burdens, regardless of when they were acquired." I watched the exact moment his entire world completely shattered. "When I smiled and signed that document with my favorite pen last night, I legally severed my empire from your existence entirely," I stated coldly. I walked away with my wealth completely intact, and I officially insulated myself from your impending financial ruin. If you had just been a decent, loyal husband, if you had not tried to publicly humiliate me and throw me away like garbage, my corporate assets would have automatically protected you under standard marital law. But your mother built a flawless, inescapable trap, and your own blinding greed made you eagerly walk right into it and lock the heavy steel door behind you. Julian collapsed heavily back into his leather chair. His spine seemed to completely melt away. He was utterly paralyzed, destroyed by the crushing realization that he and his mother were the literal architects of his absolute destruction. "Let us discuss the immediate administrative cleanup," I announced briskly, turning away from his pathetic form. "First, your corporate credit lines and your lavish business expense accounts were permanently deactivated at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. Second, the luxury suburban townhouse you currently reside in was never in your personal name. It was leased directly through Summit Crest Development. Since Ethelgard Holdings is aggressively liquidating all redundant assets today, that lease is officially terminated. You have exactly 1 hour to remove your personal clothing from my property before my private security team permanently changes the locks. Do not attempt to take the vehicles in the garage. They legally belong to the corporate fleet." Julian began to weep softly, his face buried deep in his shaking hands. "And finally," I added, my voice devoid of any human sympathy, "by tomorrow morning, my legal division will formally initiate proceedings for your personal bankruptcy. You will never secure a bank loan, lease an apartment, or hold an executive position in this country ever again. You are leaving this building with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back and a mountain of debt you could not possibly pay off in 10 lifetimes." I gave a sharp, definitive nod to the heavy security personnel waiting patiently by the door. 2 massive men in dark uniforms stepped forward, grabbing Julian by his arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. He did not struggle. He was a hollow, empty shell. As they dragged him toward the private elevator, the silver doors suddenly slid open, revealing an incredibly chaotic scene. Beatrice, Julian's mother, burst onto the executive floor. She was panting heavily, her expensive diamond jewelry clinking violently against her chest. She had clearly received a panicked phone call regarding the corporate raid and had rushed across the city to save her precious son. "Unhand him right this instant!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking hysterically as she pointed a manicured finger at the guards. "Do you have any idea who you are touching? He is the managing partner. He owns this entire building." Julian slowly lifted his head, looking at his mother with completely dead, empty eyes. "It is gone, Mother," he whispered, his voice completely devoid of life. "Everything is gone. We owe her millions of dollars." Beatrice froze in her tracks. Her furious eyes darted from her ruined, weeping son to me, standing triumphantly at the head of the long mahogany table in my tailored power suit. The sickening, undeniable realization slowly washed over her heavily powdered face. She opened her mouth to scream. She tried to hurl her usual venomous insults, but her throat simply closed up. She could only watch in mute, agonizing horror as the security guards shoved her golden child into the elevator, entirely empty-handed and permanently destroyed. The heavy doors glided shut, silencing their pathetic existence once and for all. I turned my back to the empty boardroom and walked slowly toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The morning sun was shining brightly over the bustling, gridlocked streets of Seattle far below. The heavy, suffocating weight that had chained me down for the past 5 years was finally, entirely gone. I took a deep, steadying breath, savoring the crisp, clean taste of absolute freedom. People so often underestimate the quiet woman standing in the corner. They blindly assume that someone who spends her evenings patiently stirring pots and perfectly balancing flavors has no ambition, no intelligence, and no bite. But they constantly fail to realize a fundamental, dangerous truth. The exact same hands that know how to meticulously prepare a delicate, nourishing meal are also the exact same hands that can effortlessly tear an entire empire to shreds if they are ever betrayed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city and country in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, please help us keep the channel alive by joining our Patreon. You will get access to our absolute best, highly emotional, and completely exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily scan the QR code right here on the screen, or click the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you again for your time, and I will see you in the next video.